I'm Richard Bainan. I'm from All About Writing. Joanne Hichens is a close associate of ours and works with us on various projects, including notably our annual memoir retreat, at least weekend and subsequent retreat in the Western Cape. She is the author, an editor. I'm sure you know all this, but I'm going to manfully make my way through a very short, abbreviated CV. She lives in Cape Town. She's edited numerous short story anthologies, including the Short.Sharp.Stories. She's written crime novels. We were mentioning the fact a minute ago before you came on board that she'd love to get back to those. She's written young adult novels, and she's written a memoir, the fabulously named Death and the After Parties. She has a master's in creative writing and is currently studying for a PhD, for which she earned my remark that I thought she was crazy, but all praise. She's received all sorts of awards and honors for her work. Now, none of this is of any interest to you if she doesn't deliver the goods over the next hour. So, Joanne, over to you. But before you begin, let me just say again, can you turn off your sound so that we can't hear you in case your dog starts barking or your husband or wife starts growling? Joanne.
Okay. Thank you so much, Richard. Oh, I love that idea of a wife or husband growling. I think if that happens, please do switch on your microphone and we can support you through that. Okay, thank you so much for being here. As Richard mentioned, my name is Joanne. I thought what I would do is first give you a little bit of background about the Short.Sharp.Stories project, then go into why the short story, also just for a few minutes or so, give a few guidelines of how to write a good short story, and then I'm going to pick up on the questions that we've had come through, and that's what we'll focus on. And I'm sure that you will learn from the questions and the responses to the questions. I just wanted to say as well that the PhD, yes, I think I am a little bit crazy, but it's actually on the short story. And the reason I'm doing it is that I thought I have been editing short stories now for 10 years, and that seems to be where my interest lies as far as editing is concerned. And apart from just wanting to know when I read a short story on a gut level that it's good, that I feel it's good, that my mind goes, aha, I like this. I wanted to be just a little bit more scholarly about it and really focus on what does make a good short story. So I'm hoping to build my skills, and I think that's what we all do as we go through this life, as we write. So having a competition like this is also an opportunity to practice our skills. Also to send something into deadline, because I know sometimes that people don't have a deadline. It's so easy to say, oh, I'll do it next week or next month. So I co-founded the Short.Sharp.Stories project in 2013 with the support of the CEO of the National Arts Festival at the time, Tony Lancaster, and the COO, Ismail Mohammed. And this was a part of the National Arts Fest at the time. So it was a kind of a think fest. So that's why they wanted to do short stories and get people talking about writing, talking about short stories. And we've been going ever since, with a couple of years of hiatus in between. But it feels to me actually as if the project is stronger and more exciting than it ever was. And I'm thrilled to still be a part of it. The other titles we've done are Bloody Satisfied. It was a crime anthology, which came out in 2014. And at that time, crime was a very new thing in South Africa. I think with 1994 came this freedom that we could really write whatever stories we wanted to. So there was a burgeoning of all sorts of genres of short stories. There was a title, the next one was Adults Only, which was sex and sensuality and lust, of course. We did Incredible Journey, Die Laughing, Trade Secrets, Instant Exposure, last year's Fluid, and this year's One Life, which we'll tell you a little bit about towards the end of this webinar. So why short stories? For me, I've always loved short stories. It's a sort of reading pleasure that I enjoy if I have a limited time. If I know I've only got an hour to read or half an hour, for me, it's great to just be able to pick up a short story, get into it, and by the end of that half an hour or however long it takes me to read, I'm satisfied. I've got to the ending of something. I've got to appreciate a coherent short story. Of course, I love novels too, but when it comes to editing, a novel also takes an incredible amount of creative energy, an incredible amount of my time and creative energy. And I feel that I can give more to short stories. And so that's how the project really began. I don't know if any of you were at Lester Walbruch's webinar on Monday, also about short stories. But he was one of my proteges, and he was first published in one of the short, sharp story collections. And he's since written many short stories. He's written a novel. And I felt such pride listening to him that in some small way, our short stories, excuse me, Short Sharp Stories project had helped him on his journey. And he said he writes short stories because he has commitment issues. And I laughed at that. And I think it's true for many people who write short stories. A novel is long, whereas a short story is short. It perhaps takes, well, it does take less time to write. We can be more experimental. We can try different voices. Whereas once we commit to writing a novel, we're in it for the long haul, whether that's a year or 2 or 3 years or 10 years. A short story, I feel, can, we can approach it perhaps with a little bit less pressure. We can try out our skills and we can learn on the short story. And I think that's very much part of this project, is to have people learn, test their skills. So we encourage our top writers to submit, as well as emerging authors, because it's wonderful to have a mix of both. So there we are, short stories. When it comes to just a few guidelines of writing short stories, many teachers, and I know we at All About Writing stress this, Richard does, Josie stresses it. Writing comes through character. A story is driven by character. And the better we know our character, the more believable that character will become. And in short fiction, the same applies. We don't have tons of backstory. We can't include where the character was born, where the character went to school, when the first character, when the character went to university, or when they married for the first time, or whatever is in their history. We need to start really with a short story in medias res, in the middle of things, and get that story going from the first sentence, certainly from the first paragraph. And invariably, we meet the protagonist of that short story in those first few lines. And we meet this person at a seminal moment in their lives. And generally, short stories are a slice of life, a slice of that character's life and the life of the antagonist. So you have the protagonist and the antagonist. I'm putting this in very simple terms. But basically, we have a strong character, we have supporting characters, perhaps a strong antagonist, and something happens within a setting, and within 3,000 words or 5,000 words, there has to be some kind of resolving of that situation. The character who always wants something has got to get to that point where the story now has the perfect ending. So to tell the story, we look at point of view. I clearly, as the first person point of view, I went to town that day and my car was stolen. Or the limited third person, he, she, they, in our culture where we have all sorts of genders. Um, he went to town that day. He parked his car. When he came back from the doctor's appointment, it was gone. So there might be something in the fact that the car was stolen then that is going to lead us into a story. And because we know our character, we have written about our character, perhaps we've written a sketch about our character, we know how our character would respond and what he will do next. Is he going to go to the police, or is he going to somehow track the person who stole his car and provide some sort of rough justice? So that's just an example. Omniscient is less popular, that all-seeing eye. I think my point is, though, whatever you choose, the importance lies in placing yourself in the shoes of that character as you write, to get to know the character, or in fact, to know the character before you start writing, what he does, what he says, what he does in his day, so that the ultimate product is entirely authentic. And I've mentioned setting, the place where your protagonist and your antagonist, in simple terms, your good guy and your bad guy are in some sort of situation, some sort of setting. We need to see where they operate, whether it's a small town or a city, or perhaps in a bedroom. Perhaps the story is between a man and his wife, and the setting remains the bedroom throughout that short story. What is the landscape? What does it tell us? And what does it tell us about the characters? Remembering always that well-placed detail makes a story come alive for a reader. So we'll refer a little bit later to show and tell, which is also a cornerstone of creative writing, but it comes up as part of the questions later. So I'm just going to leave that for now. But remember what we're trying to do, and this is whether we're writing a novel or a memoir or a short story, we are trying to create something visceral, something immediate, something that brings to mind pictures, just as we watch a movie in the reader's head. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't use exposition or telling, because there is a place in short stories for telling, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. But what we are all the time trying to create is something that has plot and pace, foreshadowing, uses metaphors, uses the senses, all the tricks of the trade, or rather the craft of writing, to create something that when the reader gets it into their hands or reads it on the screen, they're going to become immersed in it, as if they are in that setting, in that place, in that character's shoes. So my major advice about writing is to write, actually, to get started with an idea that interests you. And when it comes to power, because that's clearly why we're doing this webinar and workshops as well, which we're offering for free, and we'll tell you a little bit about that, is to really write about your idea of power, your concept of power, to free write. We often use this concept as well of allowing yourself to simply write, allow the pen to move across the page without censoring yourself, without thinking, oh, is it good enough? Without thinking that you need to take dictation from God, as Edna O'Brien used to say. You are just figuring out your ideas. And I think, in fact, that whole metaphor of taking dictation from God, it really just means to allow yourself to get into the zone. People also talk about channeling. I don't think that one writer does it better because they've got a connection to, the spiritual world or their characters who come alive as they write. It's being in the zone and allowing the words to come out, allowing the thoughts of that character to be placed on the page, and allowing the surprises. And if we edit ourselves too much, that doesn't happen. So I think I'm going to go straight on to the questions. What I also did want to say is, In South Africa, we used to focus on a realist culture of storytelling that kind of expressed social comment, that reflected society, and that was more real. But these days, our current short story output includes fantasy and dystopia, crime fiction, erotica, stories of gender, stories of the deeply personal, as well as the fragmentation of identity, which are all really coming back to that whole idea that we can write what we like, we can write what interests us. So don't ever think to yourself, oh, what do people want? What does the reader want? Really try and write something that interests you. Okay, questions. Colleen.
Joanne, just a
Yes,
second.
yes, Richard.
I just wanted to say that you are answering questions that have been sent in advance, but I've left a note on the chat, in the chat space, to encourage people to ask questions that might occur to them now. And if there's time, I will draw your attention to them.
Brilliant.
Okay,
Thanks.
sorry.
Richard. Yeah. So these questions were sent in beforehand. What we do at All About Writing when we have webinars is we often ask people to send in questions beforehand so that we can have a look at it and really just put our minds to coming up with some kind of feedback that is helpful. So first of all, I'm just going to deal with the practical questions about the competition power. So Bridget and a few others want to know the following. What information do you require on the cover page? Okay, so most story competitions require that the name of the writer not appear on the actual story, but rather on a separate cover page. Because we, and certainly at Short.Sharp.Stories, we read these entries blind. We have readers who go through the entries first, and they read them anonymously. We think that that is really only fair to get a sense of the stories, what we like, without knowing who wrote them, because often there is a bias, towards a best-selling author. And we really are on the lookout for new voices as well. So on the cover page, you just have the name and the title of your story, perhaps your word count. And then on the story, you can actually include the name of your story, but just not your own name. Are there any other documents beyond the story and the form required? No, only the story and the form. There is a mandatory form that we require to be filled in, basically just confirming that you're a South African citizen or that you're a long-term resident. We at Short.Sharp.Stories do not want to penalize people for being, how can I say this, foreigners, immigrants. I mean, those are the harsh terms. We feel that we are a nation of different cultures, different people, and that people who have lived here for their lifetime or for many years also have a story to tell and are South African, in a sense that they live here and they understand South Africa. So it is really open to citizens and long-term residents. Yeah, so I think I've explained that, yes. Can you explain for people who have never submitted a story before what the process is and what they should expect? So first of all, write the story to the best of your ability, remembering that there will most likely be an editing process, but the story should be a coherent whole. Once we receive the stories, our readers read them and make their suggestions. The editors also read all the stories, and usually there's an overlap of which stories are agreed on. And then we look at the mix to see how the stories will fit in. Is there enough range? For instance, if 50 people write a story of load shedding, we can probably only fit in a few of those because the whole theme of power can accommodate so many different aspects of power. But clearly, if you have a load shedding story that you are absolutely bursting to tell, and it's original and fresh, then by all means write it. And then after that, we get in touch with the writers, we put up a long list, and shortly after that, a short list, and then we get editing, working with the writers on how to enhance their stories. The production happens, and then we have a book. But we are in contact with our writers every step of the way. So I think that is really what you could expect. I just want to go back to this whole idea of presenting the story as the best story you can. A lot of people have writing groups. A lot of people send their stories to first readers. So I would really suggest that is send us a story that has been read. Perhaps your writerly friends have given you feedback and they've said, try this, do this, or the voice isn't quite authentic because of this. Or they'll brainstorm ideas for you how to make the story stronger. And it's absolutely fine to do that. I think gone are the days where, we sit struggling in a darkened room and come up with all the ideas ourselves. And, it's considered a cheat if we show it to anyone else and get their feedback. We really want to write the best stories we can. So that's what I would encourage you to do. Will writers be able to submit their stories elsewhere if they are rejected? If the stories are rejected, yes, of course, you can submit elsewhere. It's preferable, I would say, to not submit the story that you submit to our competition as well as to other competitions. So rather keep the submission to power. And once you know your story hasn't made it, by all means, send it to other avenues, other journals, and we wish you all the best of luck with that. And sadly, there are always brilliant stories that we just cannot accommodate. And often it does come back to the fact that, we have 6 stories of surfing and we just need to have a good range because that's also what an anthology is about. It needs to be more than the sum of its parts. All right, can you give us an idea of what kind of stories you are looking for? Are there any themes or tropes you absolutely don't want to see? Okay, our local writing talent continues to astound and thrill. The writing, the stories, our sheer diversity means that we're able to share truly original tales, and united by our bond of living and working in South Africa, the stories are uniquely South African generally, and that is kind of what we're looking for. We're looking for a South African sensibility. It's kind of difficult to explain that, but put it this way: if I go overseas and I come back to South Africa and I stand in a queue getting back into the country, I can stand with a diversity of people and I hear them speaking Xhosa and Sotho and English and Afrikaans and sometimes a hybrid taal made up of all of those. And I just know each person is South African in their own way. So there is nothing I could probably point to as being uniquely South African, but it is a sensibility. Apart from stories that interpret the theme in original and unusual ways, what are we looking for? We're looking for strong narrative, and that's that kind of what happens next factor. We get a lot of stories that have beautiful writing. The literature, the literary aspect is stunning, but there's no story. And by story, I mean, you want to read it and have that sense that you want to turn the page. You want to know what happens to the character or how he gets out of this situation, or how she deals with her ex-boyfriend or whatever the case may be. So we want to be enthralled by a character and preferably a setting right from the start, from the first few sentences that pique our interest and place us in the action, as I said, in medias res. Of course, we want to celebrate language and the elements of style. We know too that newer writers will be less proficient than those who plied their trade for the proverbial 10,000 hours. And I think this is hard for newer writers to come to terms with, that it takes a hell of a lot of writing to finally understand what your voice is, what your interests are. So we are on the lookout for verve and enthusiasm, and the elusive voice that captures our interest. So we are looking for that, but we also want a certain competency in English. And that doesn't mean if English is your second language that you should not be writing. Of course, you should be writing, because there are certain interesting translations that happen in that. And I think just as a country, we need to be looking at that. How do we accommodate many writers whose first language isn't English? And I'm going to say something a little bit more about that later. So as far as themes, as far as tropes, we don't entertain racism. We like to stay away from stereotypes. Really, we will, though, look at whatever story you feel strongly about and whatever genre it is. And even if it crosses genres, we are interested in those stories. Okay, Atini writes, when are you going to start accepting the entries, and what language do you accept? You can send in your story at any time. And in fact, we have had a few entries already. As long as your story reaches us before midnight on January 31st, 2025, so that gives you 2.5 months, your story will be read. We do only accept English. And the reason for this is that as the curator, when I started this, I didn't know where it was going to lead. English is really my only language. So I could only do this in English. I wish someone would start to gather stories in other languages, but that can't be Short.Sharp.Stories simply because it's run by me and the editors that are brought in to edit the anthologies. So unless there was consistent government funding and we could employ someone to bring out an anthology in other languages, we can't do that. For instance, I speak Afrikaans. I'm fairly proficient at Afrikaans, but I would not be able to write a short story that is convincing in Afrikaans, simply because I don't understand enough of the language. So I would just love it if anthologies were brought out in other languages. I think it is a real lack in our country, and it's something that we need to look at. Okay, Denise asks, I would love some ideas for ending a story. Nowadays, it almost seems as though a twist is the thing or a shocking revelation. What are some other techniques? All right, for me, I think the whole of the story almost needs to build up to that last line. So the strongest stories are for me when that last line brings it all home. But it doesn't have to be shocking. It needn't have a twist. Often the twist is developing in the story, but there does need to be a sense of, can one call it circularity? I don't want to call it closure, but it can be closure. Some kind of final understanding that comes to the reader about a story or the character in a story. Perhaps he finally gets what he wants. And when I say gets what he wants, we often refer to, was it Kurt Vonnegut, Richard, who said, even if your character wants a glass of water, he must want something. But the
On every
character,
page.
sorry,
On
Richard,
every page, he should
on
want
every
us.
page, on
On
every
every
page.
page,
Okay. For
he should
me,
want a glass of water at least. Yeah.
yeah. So for me, by the end of that story, there must be some resolution as far as what the character wants, whether it's a new wife or to get revenge or something more subtle. When you are writing, always bear in mind where you're heading with the story. What is it that you're exploring, and how would you like the character or the characters to change in the end? It can be surprising, it can be subtle, but if you're always heading towards some revelation, which will be concluded in some way, that is going to help you come to a satisfying end in your story. So I wish I could say exactly what are the techniques of coming to an end in your story, but I really think it comes back to knowing your character, knowing what your character wants, knowing what the conflict is, how that is going to be resolved, and finally coming to an ending that feels satisfying, that it is the end of that story in that particular time of that person's life. When you're writing, always bear in mind, sorry, I mentioned that again, where you're heading. And yeah, just to elaborate a little bit more on that, we do talk about knowing a sense of your destination, because whether you're writing a novel or whether you're writing a short story, it is a little bit like going on a journey. You can start your journey, you want to go to Johannesburg, for instance, and you can take the off roads, and you can take a little trip into the Karoo if you're traveling from Cape Town. But ultimately, you know that you want to be in Joburg. So you've got to keep heading there. Same with the short story, but I would suggest in a short story, there are fewer detours. You've got to make sure that you're on that highway, so to speak. And I mean that figuratively. And of course, even with the short story, sometimes we do go off on a tangent while we're writing. But then the thing is to say, does this actually serve my short story? Does it serve my character? Is it helping me to get to Johannesburg? Is it helping me to get to the ending? And that's why writing a first draft, a second draft, a third draft is important, each time honing your short story. Okay, another question is, although showing, not telling is a powerful writing tool, does this apply equally to a short story where one might simply want to give some information to pad out the short story more quickly? Absolutely, it applies. And in fact, it applies probably even more stringently because you've just got so much less time and space. You've got 3,000 words. So if you're writing a novel of 80,000 words, you've got time, and the reader will bear with you if you decide to stop off at the Karoo. They're already on that journey with you. They know the journey is going to take 290 pages. They will be there with you. They'll hang out with you for a little bit in the Karoo, as long as you get back to the journey and the path that you're on. But when it comes to a short story, there's less tolerance for that, simply because you cannot go off on a tangent for 1,000 words if your story is only 3,000 words. The reader will be saying, okay, but how does this fit in? I want to know what happens next. And when is this writer going to get back to the actual story, back to the character? So, okay, so getting back to showing, not telling, fitting in information. Yeah, so we talk about backstory, right? So most people who've written before, if you've written a novel, you know what backstory is. You can, also take that detour. You can describe a person's childhood in great detail in a novel. And again, for the same reasons, because you will get back to the main story, or perhaps that childhood informs the character in some way. But when it comes to a short story, there's almost little or no time for backstory. And of course, we need some backstory. But usually, if we know our characters well, we understand intrinsically the backstory through how the story is revealed, how the characters are revealed. The backstory is revealed through how they speak, what they're doing, what their concerns are. I would say that when you're writing, if you find it necessary to write some backstory, by all means do that. But in your second draft, you can decide, I'm going to condense this backstory into 1 or 2 sentences, or bring it in much later into the story, because I know my readers will be hooked by the time they're 2,000 words into the story. So I can actually add in a little bit of backstory.
Can
So,
I interrupt you there?
sorry?
Um, I just want to say that Frankie has a question about the ending of stories. She said, can a short story end with a cliffhanger?
Yes, okay. And I've got another question from Frankie coming up. Can it end with a cliffhanger? I don't see why not. And it depends also on our definition of a cliffhanger. Um, yeah, the cliffhanger could be that the husband arrives home, and that is the cliffhanger. but the story was about perhaps a man and his lover in the bedroom. So that could be a cliffhanger. Yes, I would say yes. Of course, it could end on a cliffhanger. I think also that your story will dictate your ending. So one can't say a short story must always end on a cliffhanger. Okay, and Frankie goes on to ask, and I take it it's the same Frankie, could be a different Frankie, but she says, every time I try to write a short story, I fail miserably. Oh, many of us know that feeling, but we just keep on failing and failing better until we produce a great short story. So she says, I dive straight into the action, show a hint of backstory, give out clues with subtle detail. Then I either tell the punchline too early or miss it altogether with a cliffhanger that goes nowhere. What am I doing wrong? Am I confusing a short story with a scene from a novel? And I've said, no, not at all. That actually sounds like a great recipe for a good short story. And what I've said is, I've asked if Frankie has readers, close readers, or an editor. It's often quite difficult to say what you're doing wrong without seeing the text. It depends too on the word count. You need at least, let's say, those 3,000 words to tease out the story. Perhaps you need to get some advice here, because it sounds to me as if you are on the right track as far as writing a short story. You have that hint of backstory. You've gone right into the action. You've given out the clues, your subtle detail. So you've also said, I either tell the punchline too early. You're giving yourself clues as to what you do. So if you know that you're giving the punchline too early, then move the punchline down. Yeah, or you miss it altogether with a cliffhanger that goes nowhere. If you know that your cliffhanger goes nowhere, then take out that cliffhanger. Keep it perhaps for a later point in the story, so that your story begins to make sense, so that you don't have the cliffhanger too early. But again, this is where your Readly friends can help you. If you have specific questions that you can ask your Readly friends, your Writerly group, or whoever you're working with, they'll be able to help you with that as well. Someone asks, please, could you revise the structure of a short, sharp story? Must it also follow the hero's journey like a novel, i.e. starting with the protagonist's ordinary world and so forth? And I have said, no, it can, but it needn't follow the hero's journey. My belief that it actually should follow some sort of journey, as I've described. But my theory on the shape of a story is really to just start the writing first, see where the theme and the words take you. Kurt Vonnegut does the absolute best demonstration of a story, the shape of it. And I suggest you go and find it on YouTube. I think it's actually called Kurt Vonnegut's Shape of a Story. And he just draws some squiggly lines on a blackboard. But what he basically says is you have a beginning, you have a middle, you have an end, and how you develop that is up to you. Where you start is up to you. Do you start in the conflict, or do you start with a sense of happiness and then create the conflict? So I guess what I am saying is there are many ways to write a short story. I don't think I would get hung up on theory or how a short story should be. Really, we need to go back to allowing our characters to show us the way. And depending on who your character is, again, the setting that he finds himself, what he encounters, what he does, possibly in conflict with another character that finally comes to a head. And I think this is enough to keep you going. Richard, you teach the hero's journey, and I know many people swear by the hero's journey. I refer to the hero's journey when I'm writing memoir. It's very useful for me then. And also for me, it makes more sense if one's writing a longer piece of work. But when it comes to the immediacy of a short story, then for me, it is possibly less relevant. And if you'd like to jump in here, please do.
I will.
Yeah.
I think that the hero's journey is, as you say, most useful when you're dealing with a long piece. When you're dealing with a short story, you can skip out some of the stages. But crucially, there are some stages you can't skip out. You can't, for instance, skip out the inciting incident, I don't think, which is an element. It's not called that in the hero's journey, but it exists in the hero's journey. Um, yeah, I, I think that, the hero's journey, according to its original outline, has 17 stages. And frankly, in a short story, you're never going to be able to kind of hit all of those stages, and nor should you try to. But the most important thing about a hero's journey is that it's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you how to write a story. It it tells you gives you insight into the story you have written. So it's as well not to try to use it as a recipe. While
Okay,
I've,
great.
while I've got the floor, can I just
Yes.
say that Lynn Joffe has on the chat has put up a link um, to the Shape of Stories by Kurt Vonnegut. So you can find that link there. There are a couple of other very quick stories, quick questions that I'd like to squeeze in. Um, I can't pronounce your name. Masutani says, is it permitted to make more than one submission of different stories to Short.Sharp.Stories? In other words, is there a limit to the number of stories you can?
Okay.
And then I've got, so will you answer that? Yes, it's a yes or no one, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It is a no. It is just one story per person.
Okay. And then Lynn Joffe has a very nice question. She says, do you feel that flash fiction has a place in the short story pantheon? In other words, shorter, weirder ways to tell, she says.
Okay, shorter, weirder ways to tell. Absolutely. I mean, flash fiction can be what, between 300 words to probably 500, maybe even 1,000 words. But I have tried it and it's not for me. It's just too short. I can't seem to get anywhere in that number of words. But there are practitioners that are writing the most incredible short stories, with flash fiction. And I think it also comes to the fact that as a literary world, we are changing. Our um, concentration span is a little bit shorter. We like immediacy. Flash fiction is almost like a literary prose poem in a sense, and it can be very exciting, I think, for writers to see how they can create a story in such a small space of time, and also looking very carefully at language. And it's fun to read. It is great to read. So yeah, I think it definitely has a place. So yes, I hope that answers your question, Lynn. And in fact, Kerry Hamilton, for instance, brought out a anthology of flash fiction this year with Caravan Press. I think there were 20 authors or 25 in that volume, and they're hoping to bring out another one next year. So follow Caravan Press as well. Or where else could you find it? The Rosebank Writers Group. We can perhaps add this at the end of as well, because really it is a way to practice your craft. But it does come easier to some people than others, just as some people don't like the genre of the short story. They feel it's too short for them. They want to put in the backstory. They want to go, into the deep history of who their characters are. They want to give more, and the short story doesn't provide them with that. So the short story is also needs to suit a person's temperament. Okay, so I think that answers that question. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going to yes, I think we did show and tell, didn't we? Okay, so Fred Hatman or Howard Donaldson, perhaps it's some of these questions we've amalgamated because they're quite close. Um, I am in the process of writing a somewhat fictionalized memoir made up of 45 short stories, tightening up and revising to create a stronger interlinking narrative through the stories. This is proving quite tricky, as most of the life events I have chosen to write about do not follow directly on from the previous one, and some are a few years apart. Do you have any advice on how I could make my short stories, ranging from 800 to 1,500 words in length, jump over the intervals of time and flow in a steady and continuous arc? Okay, I think you've got to decide if you first of all want them to flow in a continuous and steady arc, or if you want to present them almost as those flash pieces, as those vignettes of a life well lived, of a life and its challenges. And then I would suggest you can simply jump from one piece to the next. We forget sometimes that our reader is pretty astute and will make the inference themselves that this section or that section is a year later or 3 years later. You could use a brief descriptor. You could say something like when I was 12, and the next section could be when I was 16. Or you could use other headings. I had a memory of being there. 3 years later, this happened. So those short headings can give a clue of time passing. So there are many different ways to do it. Personally, I love those kinds of short story collections, particularly by one person, or memoirs that skip time without explanation and move us along. They are perhaps a little bit experimental, but I would say just beware of belaboring a text by trying to explain the jump. If you can do it in a concise, clean way, that sounds like how you could be tackling that. And in fact, there's a wonderful memoir, actually. It's called a memoir by Dennis Herson, and I never get the names right. It's when King Kong was a boxer in
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah. Richard, you might remember the name, and he's written a few others, but the entire memoir is written in the terms of I remember. He writes I remember, which is followed by a sentence of a memory. And then the entire, however many pages, 100 pages, is simply a collection of those sentences. I remember, I remember, I remember. There's no explanation between them. He just goes from one thought to the next. And there is a certain, sorry, I'm just, okay, how do I, okay, I'm just, whoever's on the phone, sorry, that's my phone. Yeah, so there are many ways to do it. Okay, I'll just leave it there because I see we've got 10 minutes. We have more questions. So Peter says, could you elaborate on how the use of certain expressions, whether formal or informal, might impact a writer's connection with their audience? For instance, an American friend once told me that my phrasing sounded tired, which left me feeling somewhat awkward and uncertain. As a non-native English speaker, I wonder if using familiar idioms or phrases like let the cat out of the bag, or spill the tea, or beauty sleep could disadvantage a writer in terms of maintaining reader engagement and sustaining interest in a story. Okay, all these phrases, let the cat out of the bag, spill the tea, beauty sleep, they're all cliches. They're overused ways of speaking and writing and are thus actually kind of unoriginal. So what we try and do as writers is get away from those cliches. And cliches, they're cliches because they are popular. We use them all the time. It's a great way to express ourselves. But as writers, we want to try and explore language in a different way and come up with other images and other imagery. So any text peppered with cliches will probably elicit a little bit of hesitance from a reader, as I know I certainly am looking for something fresher. So one or two is fine, but the whole point of creative writing is probably to use more interesting similes and metaphors. It is about the language after all. That said, some people, including me, do not write great metaphors. I am just not one of those writers. I struggle with that. So I've tried to accept the way that I write is really to be clear, to use more direct language, to focus more on the story and on dialogue, because for me, dialogue is one of my strengths. I have to work hard at description. But the more one does it, the more one is able to create those paragraphs or expressions that do ring true. So what we have to do is practice our craft, know what our strengths are as well as possibly our weaknesses are. And then in the editing stage, that second draft, that third draft, we can start to eradicate those unoriginal bits that we've written. So we may have a good story, but we've got to look at the phrasing and challenge ourselves to write better. And also to develop the hide of a crocodile, an elephant, a rhino, whichever one you choose, because there are always going to be people who criticize our writing. Our own writing groups are going to say, look, this doesn't work, and we need to actually, sometimes just take a deep breath and take that on board, allow ourselves to mull over it, and then come back to how we think we can make it work better. And even when we're published, people are going to say, oh, that's rotten, or that's brilliant. And you'll often find that there are these extremes when it comes to opinions. So, okay, so I hope that helps you. Just keep on going, get rid of the cliches, try to be original, but it all takes work. Okay, another question. I'm not sure who this is from, but for aspiring writers with a demanding work schedule, such as a 5 or 6 day week, from 7:30 to 5 p.m., what daily writing target would you recommend, whether in terms of typed A4 pages or word count? Okay, and again, it's a subjective type of thing, because it really depends on whether you can find the time each day where you can fit it in. Are you a morning person? Are you a nighttime person? I cannot write before 9 in the morning because I'm asleep. Some people are up at 5 in the morning and they say, oh my God, this is the time I can write. No one bothers me. I love being up with the sun. I write my most original work between 5 and 7. If you're one of those people, bravo. Some people write at night. They say, I write from 10 to midnight. I'm not one of those people either. I'm watching Netflix. So for me, I've got to fit it in. Sorry, Richard, I see you. I've got to fit it in between 9 and 12, or after that. And sometimes we just don't have time to fit it in every day. And if you've got a job, maybe you'll be writing weekends, or 3 days a week. The main point I'm going to make is that you just commit to it, that you find a time and you try and commit to it. And even if you can't find a time, you say Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I'm going to do it. I will find a space, even if it's my lunch hour. And some people can churn out 1,000 words in an hour. Others only 500. Sometimes people can only write one decent sentence in an hour. So again, it is just commit, find a time, and keep going. Richard, yes, what would you
Yes,
like
I
to
just
add?
want to quote two people I know. One
Okay.
writes 9,000 words a day. All right. She's a many published author. She's written lots of books and routinely 9,000 words a day. Another one writes and is very happy when, after a hard day's work at his computer, he writes 300 words.
Yeah.
It's the
So
entire spectrum. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. There is the entire spectrum, and you've got to find what is comfortable for you. And again, we don't compare, you know. Yeah, so we just try and do what we can do and write the stories that we want to write. Then I've got two last questions, which I think are quite important. So, yeah, do lots of people have to run, or what do you think, Richard? Because I do want to just talk about the workshops. Yeah, look, I think let's just speak very briefly about the workshops so that everyone knows about the workshop. So we get it in before 7 o'clock. But after that, for those who can bear with me, I'm going to answer the last two questions because I think they're quite important for writers, particularly writers who's who are writing in English as a second language. So first of all, on the 23rd of November and the 30th of November, we are doing 2 free workshops through All About Writing and Short.Sharp.Stories. They are on the 2 Saturday afternoons from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock. And what I'm going to do is actually get you to write. So particularly for the newer writers, if you really are thinking, oh my God, I don't even know where to start, I'm going just to show you some techniques of how to free yourself and write a few thousand words, so that you can just experience what it is like to actually just get into that habit of writing and a way of getting into writing a short story. So that is the 23rd of November and the 30th of November. But Trish will send all this information out with the recording of today's session, I think. Isn't that right? Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. All right. So I think that's all I wanted to say. Oh, I also wanted to say our latest anthology is for sale. It's called One Life. Trish will put up the cover also towards the end. And if anyone orders pre-printing, which is now before the 25th of November, we're selling for 270 Rand. It will retail for 320 in the stores. So that's a nice discount. And also, we'll be sending you a mystery anthology. I won't say what it is, but it's a good deal. And what I also want to say is the more we read, the better our writing becomes. I feel really strongly about this. And I know people say it all the time, but I myself didn't read much for about 6 months. And I've started to read again. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I must read more because this is teaching me so much. It teaches me about my own work. It also teaches me how to be more, how to evaluate other people's work better. Because I think as an editor, one is always reading with a view to what does this person do that works? And what does this person do that perhaps isn't working so well? All right, so if you've got a few minutes, let's just do these questions quickly. Okay. Helen says, any comments about the use of the vernacular, which is the language or dialect spoken by ordinary people in a particular country or region? And she wants to know, can we use it in dialogue? How do I feel about it? Okay, this is an important question, especially when we have so many different languages in South Africa. So I would say, look, if your protagonist is a granny, she will speak slower, she will use certain old-fashioned phrases, she will use some of those cliched phrases, perhaps. Whereas if your protagonist is a teenager, she'll be au fait with way more hip culture and will use the words that go with that. So if your character is, let's say, Afrikaans or Zulu or French Congolese or whatever, their speech patterns will be different. And you can incorporate that into dialogue. You also don't want to beat the reader over the head with it, but I think it's absolutely fine to acknowledge the fact that a character, let's say a character is Afrikaans, that she might well respond to another character in your story with a few words of Afrikaans or an Afrikaans phrase. So I would say absolutely yes, do it. And personally, I appreciate a bit of vernacular in the dialogue, and even in the story. Again, though, if your protagonist, let's say, as another example, is a Black university graduate who's lived in the United States for her whole life, has never spoken a word of Xhosa, she might be aware of her culture and wanting to explore it, but it might be absolutely not appropriate to include her using the vernacular, the language, because she doesn't know the vernacular, so you can't force it. Also in South Africa, we do kind of speak a kind of mixed up taal sometimes, which I've referred to before. And that's great to include that in a story. And I'm thinking particularly of Terry Ann Adams' short story collection, White Chalk. And is a Chase Reese, who've both written in the vernacular, and they've written in Kaapse taal, which is a kind of mix of English and Afrikaans, and it's fascinating to read. And I love the authenticity about their Kaapse stories. So I always say to people, yes, if you are, let's say, living in a rural village, and we just had the experience now with one of our writers whose language is a second language. She speaks Siswati. She might even be on this group here. And I said to incorporate some words of Siswati, because your character is a rural character, and it might just bring more depth to your story. And she did. And I think it's really made a difference there. So yes, please. And that's the beauty of being South African. If we have all these different languages, yes, I want stories in English, but if your character is, whatever, use that in your story. Your character will have a different viewpoint. Your character will speak differently, will live differently, will have different experiences. And for me, that is always the joy of the Short Sharp Stories project, is that we have this wide experience, and we showcase this diversity of voices and writing. Okay, then the last question I just wanted to answer. C4 asks about writing English as a second language. Will the stories be penalized? No, not at all. Writers writing English as a second language, it can bring up a really interesting use of language, which I mentioned earlier, and which can enhance a story and the voice. So I would say, go for it. Enjoy writing your story. And some people who use English as a second language are incredibly proficient. I mean, they would write better stories than first language speakers. So I'm not saying that your story won't be as good because you're not a first language speaker. Not at all. What I'm saying is your story as a second language speaker might actually be really interesting and really relevant and really use language in a way that's fascinating. Because, as I said, in South Africa, we're a mixed bag. So let's write more of these stories. Another thing is, it's all practice. So for the new writers who want to be writing in English, it is practice. It's all about practice. It's all about writing in English, reading in English, and that goes for everybody, whatever your language is. If English is your first language, the more you read, the better you will get. So yes, and just to say finally that many of our writers submit more than once, so you can only submit one story at a time, but they submit for the first year, and then again the second year, and then the third year, because they've been learning their skill and practicing. There's always that time of, aha, great, you're in the collection. So it is now 7:06.
There's one more technical question that
Yeah,
I think you could answer. When are
okay.
you going to start informing writers if their entries are accepted or not?
Okay, so we will be reading stories in February in 2025, and we will inform writers at the beginning of March, because this project has been funded by the National Arts Council, and not every project we do is funded, but often with these funded projects, they have a cutoff date for when the bills need to be paid. So we need to pay everybody, including the writers, because we're offering the writers compensation because we feel writers should be paid. So the whole project needs to be done literally by the end of the 31st of March. We'll probably only publish in April, possibly May, but all the editing will be done March. So in February, writers will be told. Just another thing for those who submit. You submit a story, write your next story, just move on. Because I remember when I first started writing, I'd submit a story and then I'd wait for 3 months waiting, anxious. Are they going to take my story? And then when they didn't take my story, I would turn into this little pile of jelly and cry for 3 weeks. No, the whole point is to just keep writing and learn and develop your craft. If your story gets in, great. If it doesn't get in, just move on. Just keep on writing. So there we go. I think, Richard, if maybe you could, yeah, take note of any more questions. I don't want to keep people too much longer,
No, I think
unless it's
I
something
think we've shot our boat.
we've shot our bolt. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
to
thank
use a
you.
cliche.
To use a cliche, and cliches are fine, but when a story is full of cliches, we need to cut some. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. And please do come to our workshop where you will be doing some writing. And I hope that'll be exciting and fun. Cool.
Okay, thank you,
Carrie,
everyone.
bye. Bye.